Notwithstanding that disappointment, we had not lost every prospect of signal advantage. The course of the Aisne opposed an obstacle to the enemy's passage in the direction which he had taken to effect his retreat. Soissons was the key of that barrier. Soissons, the fortifications of which had been repaired, was in our possession, and the garrison consisted of 1,400 Poles. The enemy had no hope of carrying it by a coup de main. Blucher was at Berneville near La Ferté-Milon. His soldiers scattered over the plains of Gandalou and Uilly-le-Château, with the Aisne before and the Marne behind them, pressed on the left by the troops of the Duc de Treviso and the Duc de Ragusa, and on the right by Napoleon's army, ran great risks of being hemmed in at Soissons and forced to lay down their arms and baggage at the foot of the old ramparts of that town. Napoleon, inspired with these hopes, debouched on the 3rd of March by the new bridge of La Ferté. He made a rapid movement on the highway from Chalon as far as Château-Thierry, and at that point, turning his army to the left in the direction of Soissons, he brought it back on the enemy's flanks. Circuitous as was that march, our troops, by following the road, marched quicker than the Prussians, intercepted the way to Reims, and were enabled to attack before they could pass the Aisne. Napoleon then passed the night at Bezou-Saint-Germain, while the right of the French army was thus advancing by the route of Château-Thierry to Soissons. The enemy was turned on our left by the troops of the Duc de Treviso and Ragusa, who were also pushing forward to Soissons, the former by keeping the high road of Villers-Cotterêts, the latter by passing through Neuilly-le-Saint-Front. Thus hemmed in on every side, the enemy gave himself up for lost, but at that critical moment, the drawbridges of Soissons were lowered to receive the astonished Prussian army. The unexpected passage was opened to it by Generals Bülow and Witzingerode, who had been brought by mere chance to the other bank of the Aisne. General Bülow, who had marched from Belgium across Picardy, had in the first instance attacked the arsenal of La Fère, and afterwards effected a junction with General Witzingerode on the 2nd of March in the environs of Soissons. These generals, having opened conferences with the French commandant, had succeeded in persuading him that the best thing he could do was to capitulate. On the morning of the 4th of March, Napoleon, still unacquainted with what had just taken place at Soissons, continued his movement on the Aisne. The imperial army passed at the foot of the ruins of the castle of Fère-en-Tardenois and arrived at Fismes, where it cut off the road from Soissons de Reims. It was there that we learned the loss of Soissons and the good fortune of the Prussians. Chapter 8, Excursion Beyond the Aisne, Battle of Craonne, Actions of Laon and Reims, from the 4th to the 18th of March. These long marches, rendered useless by a series of unexpected disappointments, had thrown the army to a considerable distance from its line of operations, which had been hitherto confined between the Seine and the Marne. It was with feelings of uneasiness that we found ourselves transferred to the openings of the Ardennes. Our apprehensions with respect to what was passing in our rear increased with the distance which separated us from the Seine. No intelligence was received from Lusigny, none from Châtillon. The Allies, received and relieved from their alarms, were no doubt ashamed of advances which had nearly cost them the suspension of hostilities. The English ministry, no doubt taking advantage of the confidence with which the return to good fortune inspires the most timid, could not have failed to adopt precautions against future vicissitudes. These conjectures, which we entertained with the most anxious feelings, were but too well founded. England had just obtained the signature of the Treaty of Chaumont. By that treaty, dated the 1st of March, the sovereigns, confirming their alliance by closer ties, were engaged to adhere to the project of confining France within her ancient limits. It is even probable that the idea of dethroning Napoleon had been favorably received, but through respect for Austria, some conferences were still to be held at Châtillon, with the view of ascertaining whether the Duc de Vicenza would come to the resolution of signing the treaty. These determinations were not known until a later period, but it was already evident that the state of affairs had become more difficult. The most discouraging apprehensions began to be circulated, and Napoleon himself appeared more gloomy. In constant pursuit of the enemy, his eyes were struck on all sides with devastation and conflagrations. He was surrounded only by miserable inhabitants who, in their despair, were more inclined to raise the cry of vengeance than the prayers of peace. You were right, sir. Such were the sentiments expressed to him in the most energetic language, and with one common voice by the inhabitants of the countries, rescued for an instant by our arms from the enemy. You were right when you recommended us to rise in mass. Death is 1,000 times preferable to the vexations, the hard treatment, and the cruelties which must be endured by those who submit to a foreign yoke. A general sentiment of despair was converted into a weapon against the enemy. It was employed by Napoleon, who even undertook to communicate to the most timid that kind of energy which fear is capable of inspiring. A free course was thrown open to the cry of vengeance. The Moniteur was filled with all the complaints, with all the lamentations of the wretched inhabitants of Montmirail, of Montereau, and of Nancy, with the sufferings of Troyes, and the still more recent horrors of which the plains of La Ferté-Sous-Jouarre and Meaux had just been the theater. All the towns which had been afflicted with the scourge of war sent deputies to Paris to describe their misery and demand vengeance. Inquiries were everywhere set on foot, but the calamities were too great to call for exaggeration. Hatred and consternation were employed in all their real coloring as substitutes for the ardor which ought to have been kindled by patriotism alone. The great examples of antiquity were invoked. France was reminded of her achievements in 1792. And new courage was attempted to be derived even from the example of what Spain, Russia, and Prussia had just performed against ourselves. In these extremes of disaster, recourse could only be had to extreme measures, but it must be confessed, these measures produced at Paris, and in all the great towns, an effect quite contrary to that which was expected from them. The inhabitants were too civilized to adopt the decisive conduct of the Russians and Spaniards. The imagination of the citizens was shocked at the violence of the measures suggested to them. They recoiled from the hideous picture of war. The recital of all those deputies who had escaped from the conflagration and ruins of the provinces depressed, instead of exalting public spirit, and peace was again loudly demanded as the period of so many horrors. In all parts of the country, on the contrary, every man was already a soldier, and the only difficulty was that of rallying them. Before Napoleon left the town of Fiume, he signed a decree by which he not only authorized but commanded all Frenchmen to take up arms on the approach of our troops and to assist them in their operations. By a second decree of the same day, Napoleon declared that all mayors or public functionaries who might chill instead of exciting the spirit of those over whom they were placed should undergo the punishment of traitors. The greatest possible publicity was given to these decrees, they were productive of no effect. It was soon remarked that Napoleon was less desirous in issuing them of obtaining military resources than of employing them as political instruments of intimidation. These appeals, these demonstrations of levies en masse were designed to attract the attention of the allied sovereigns. They might perhaps abate their malice in letting them perceive to what extremities the war might be carried if it were prosecuted on each side with too much fury. The more critical circumstances became, the less was Napoleon inclined to prolong the excursion in which he was engaged. He could not, however, bring himself to the resolution of giving up his pursuit of the Prussians without rendering them incapable, at least for some time, of resuming offensive operations against us. When they were behind the end and unable to effect a junction with the reinforcements supplied by the armies of the north, it was to be supposed that they would no longer decline a battle. Napoleon's whole attention was employed in accelerating that event